The palms were dying. They had been dying for 3 years, since the night King Selim Vas took the throne drenched in his father's blood and stood before his court with empty eyes and a crown that didn't yet fit his head. The royal gardeners whispered that it was an omen. The priests called it a curse. The court physicians blamed a fungal blight creeping up from the roots, invisible until the fronds turned black at their tips and curled inward like fingers closing over a wound. Selim called it irrelevant. He stood at the window of the high tower every morning and watched the grove below, 300 royal palms planted by his great-grandmother when this kingdom was still young and soft and full of possibility. Now their trunks bore the brown stain of rot, spiraling upward like ink dropped in water. Some had already fallen. Their great bodies lay in the garden like soldiers who had given up, and no one moved them because no one dared ask the king what to do. His steward, Lord Fenwick, had learned quickly in the first months of Selim's reign. You did not ask the king questions he had not invited. You did not linger in doorways. You did not make direct eye contact for longer than 3 seconds. And you absolutely, categorically, did not bring him an omega without warning. Which was why the morning Fenwick knocked on the tower door with sweat on his brow and a piece of parchment crumpled in his fist, Selim already knew something had gone terribly wrong. "Speak," Selim said, without turning from the window. "Your Majesty." Fenwick's voice had that particular quality it got when he was trying to sound calm and failing entirely. "There has been a development regarding the border villages." "There is always a development regarding the border villages." Selim's voice was flat as stone. "That is why we have a border garrison." "Yes, sire, however." A pause. "This development arrived on foot, alone, carrying nothing but a satchel and what appears to be a great deal of audacity." Selim turned then. He was not a tall man by Alpha standards, but he had a quality of presence that made rooms feel smaller when he entered them. His eyes were a pale, glacial gray, the color of water under winter ice, and they rarely blinked at the frequency most people found comfortable. His dark hair was cropped close on the sides, longer on top, and he wore it pushed back with the careless precision of someone who had long ago stopped caring whether he looked approachable, because he had decided he did not want to be approached. "An omega," he said. The word was not a question. He could smell it even through the closed tower door, something warm and green cutting through the ever-present rot, something alive. Fenwick's silence was confirmation enough. "Send it away." "We tried, Your Majesty." The king's eyes narrowed by precisely 1 millimeter. "You tried." "He, the omega, refused." Fenwick cleared his throat. Quite loudly, he said, and I quote directly because I feel it's important you have the exact phrasing, "Tell your king that I've walked 400 miles and I haven't come this far to be turned away by a man with a clipboard." A long silence fell over the tower. Outside, a dead palm frond detached from its tree and spiraled down through the gray morning air. "What," said King Selim Vas very quietly, "is its name?" Chapter 2, The Omega Who Did Not Kneel. His name was Sable Wren. He was 23 years old, second designation Omega, formerly of the village of Holtz crossing on the kingdom's eastern border. A village that no longer existed, having been swallowed 3 months ago by the spreading palm rot that had jumped from the royal grove to the agricultural palms that lined the eastern roads, and from there to the structural palms that held up the roofs of homes, and from there to the homes themselves. He was not particularly tall. He was not particularly beautiful in the classical sense. His face was angular and sharp-featured, his dark brown skin weathered from months of travel, his natural hair pulled back under a wrap of faded indigo cloth. His eyes were amber, not the golden amber that romance poets wrote about. Actual amber, dark and resinous and ancient-looking, like something with a secret trapped inside it. He sat in the receiving hall of Vas Palace without sitting the way people usually sat in the receiving hall of Vas Palace, Most petitioners perched at the edge of their chair and folded their hands and looked at the floor. Sable Wren sat back, crossed one ankle over his knee, and looked directly at the throne. The throne was empty, which did not seem to concern him. Selim watched him from the upper gallery for 3 full minutes before descending. In those 3 minutes, Sable Wren examined his own fingernails, appeared to find something interesting on the ceiling, picked up the decorative pen from the petitioner's table and turned it over in his hands, set it back down, and then, inexplicably, smiled at nothing, as though he'd just remembered a private joke. Selim descended the stairs. He did not announce himself. He never did. He simply appeared, and the room rearranged itself around him, guards straightening, stewards stepping back, and he walked to the throne and sat and looked at the Omega with his winter ice eyes and said nothing. Sable Wren looked back. "You're younger than I expected," Sable said. Somewhere behind Selim, Fenwick made a small, horrified sound. "You are," said the king, "addressing your sovereign." "I know who I'm addressing. You look about 30. I expected older." Sable tilted his head. "Though I suppose 3 years of whatever you've been doing to yourself will do that. Age a person." "Whatever I have been doing to myself," Selim repeated. "Grieving, isolating, letting a kingdom fall apart while you stand in a tower and watch." Sable's voice was not cruel. That was the thing that made it so extraordinary. He said these things the way you'd say it looks like rain or the soup needs salt. Observation, not attack. "The palm rot started in your grove. It's been spreading for 3 years because no one has addressed the source. I know how to stop it." The hall was so quiet that the distant sound of wind through dying palms was audible. "You," said Selim. "Me." "You know how to stop the palm rot?" "Yes." "An Omega from a border village." Sable's amber eyes flickered. "My mother was the keeper of the eastern grove before it died, her mother before her. The knowledge of root disease in this kingdom's palms has lived in my family for 4 generations. I grew up diagnosing blight the way other children learned their letters." He leaned forward now, elbows on knees. "And I walked 400 miles because every official I wrote to sent my letters back unopened, and every garrison I approached turned me away. And eventually I decided that if the mountain would not come to me, I would go irritate the mountain directly." Selim stared at him. He had not been stared at truly, mutually stared at in 3 years. Everyone else looked away. It was automatic, deferential, an instinct in the face of alpha dominance. This Omega sat there and held his gaze like it was nothing, like it was easy, like the weight of Selim's presence was a thing he could simply decide not to feel. It was infuriating. It was the most interesting thing that had happened in 3 years. "You will be given a room," Selim said finally. "You will present your findings to my agricultural minister in the morning." He stood to leave. "Your Majesty." He stopped. He did not turn. "What?" "The agricultural minister sent back my 3rd letter with a note that said this matter is above your station. If you route me through him, I'll be dismissed by noon and you'll have wasted both our time." A pause. "I'll present my findings to you, or I'll present them to no one." Selim stood very still. Behind him, Fenwick was almost certainly having some kind of quiet cardiac event. 9 o'clock, the king said and walked out. Chapter 3, Root Systems. He did not sleep well. He rarely did. The thing about Selim Voss that his court understood in the abstract but could not quite emotionally process was that he had been 18 years old when his father died. When he had watched his father die slowly, over 6 months, the palm rot having somehow gotten into the old king's lungs, which the physicians called impossible, and which happened anyway because the world did not particularly care what physicians called impossible. He had been 18 and an alpha and newly presented, and his father's court had been full of people who wanted things from him: alliances, marriages, land grants, mercy, revenge. and he had learned very quickly that the only way to survive it was to want nothing back, to need nothing, to be the eye of the storm. Cold was safe. Cold was armor. Cold was the thing that had gotten him through 3 years of running a kingdom while quietly, privately, thoroughly falling apart. He sat at his desk at 2 in the morning and read through the letters his steward had compiled. There were 4 of them, all from the same hand, increasingly direct. The first was formal, the language careful, the tone appropriately deferential. The second was slightly less formal. The third had clearly been written in frustration. The fourth simply said, "Your kingdom's palms are dying from a systemic fungal infection that originated in contaminated soil in the royal grove approximately 3 to 4 years ago. The infection travels through root networks. You cannot treat the fronds. You must treat the roots. I can explain the process in detail if someone will please read this letter. S. Wren, of Holt's Crossing, formerly." Formerly. Selim had not thought until this moment about what formerly asterisk meant, about the village that had stopped existing, about the Omega who had nowhere left to go home to, who had walked 400 miles anyway, not because there was anything in it for him, but because someone needed to say the thing that wasn't being said. He closed the letters and sat in the dark for a long time. At 9 o'clock, he was at the table in the small council chamber, and Sable Wren walked in with a roll of diagrams under his arm and dark circles under his eyes, and the expression of someone who had also not slept, and who had also decided it didn't matter. "Sir," Selim said. Sable stopped. "I beg your pardon." "Sit." Selim gestured at the chair across from him. "And I will not call you Omega. You will not call me asterisk your king if it impedes your meaning. We are here to discuss root systems." A beat of silence. Sable sat down, unrolled his diagrams, and began to talk. He talked for 2 hours. He talked the way a person talks when they have been carrying information alone for a long time, and have finally found somewhere to put it, with precision and relief in equal measure. He had drawings of the root systems, cross-sections of infected versus healthy tissue, maps of the spread pattern plotted against water drainage channels, a proposed treatment sequence involving soil amendment and controlled removal. Selim listened. He asked questions, real questions, not the performative questions of someone managing a petitioner, questions that followed the thread of what Sable was saying, that pushed back when something was unclear, that built on the answers they received. Sable answered them. He also twice corrected the king's understanding of something, and did not apologize for it, and Selim found to his own mild bewilderment that he did not want an apology. He wanted the correction. "How long will treatment take?" Selim asked when they had reached the end of the diagrams. "If we start immediately, and if you can mobilize a full ground crew, 6 months before we see significant improvement. A full year before the spread is contained." Sable looked at the map. "Some of the palms in the outer ring of the grove won't survive. We'll need to remove them." "And the ones at the center?" A pause. "The oldest ones, the ones your great-grandmother planted." Sable met his eyes. "If we move fast enough, yes, we can save them." Selim looked at the map for a long moment. He thought about his father standing in that grove on a summer afternoon, holding a small and fidgeting 8-year-old Selim by the hand, explaining that these palms were older than their family's rule, and would be standing long after it ended. He thought about the way the fronds had moved in the wind that day, green and alive, and full of a vast, indifferent patience that he had, as a child, found deeply comforting. "What do you need?" he said. Sable blinked, as though he hadn't quite expected to get this far. "A ground crew, as I said, access to the grove at all hours, authority to direct the gardening staff, supplies." He listed them, and Selim listened and nodded and wrote nothing down because he had the kind of memory that didn't need to. "Done," he said. "All of it?" Sable stared at him. "Just like that?" "Just like that." "I assumed there would be more deliberation. Committee review, a waiting period. You presented your case, it was sound. Selim stood, which was the signal that the meeting was ending. You will report to me directly, weekly, not to Fenwick, not to the agricultural minister, to me. Sable slowly began rolling up his diagrams. And where will I be staying? The palace has guest quarters. For how long? For as long as this takes. Selim picked up his notes. A year, you said. At minimum. Then for at least a year. He walked to the door. Your Majesty. He stopped again. He was, he noted with some private exasperation, going to keep stopping every time this Omega said those two words. What? Thank you, Sable said, quietly, without performance. Selim stood in the doorway for 1 second longer than was strictly necessary. Don't thank me, he said. Save the palms. Part 2, What Grows in Darkness. Chapter 4, The Scent of Living Things. The first week was professional, efficient. Selim gave orders, resources moved, ground crews assembled. Sable worked from dawn until after dark, coming back to the palace with soil under his fingernails and diagrams updated in cramped handwriting. And Selim received his evening reports and asked his pointed questions, and that was all. It would have continued being all, except for the heat wave. Late summer in the capital was always warm, but the third week of Sable's residency brought a heat that the old palace cooks called the breath of the south. Wet and thick and pressing. The kind of heat that made the rotting palms smell worse and made everyone move more slowly than they should, and made the suppressants that Selim's palace physicians provided to all Omega staff slightly less effective than they were meant to be. He smelled it before he understood what it was. He was walking past the grove at dusk, which he had taken to doing because Sable was usually in the grove at dusk, and he had a report question that could have waited until morning, but which he had decided could not wait until morning. And the wind shifted, and something warm and impossible hit him like a hand to the chest. Selim stopped walking. In 10 years of being an alpha, he had smelled Omega preheat twice. Once at a political function, where it had been someone else's attendant and deeply none of his business. Once, briefly, in the early chaos after his father's death, when he'd been too far gone in grief to register it as anything other than noise. This was neither of those things. This was Sable Wren standing 40 feet away in the dying grove with his back to the king, pressing his hands against a palm trunk and talking quietly to it, actually talking to it, which Selim filed away as a detail to examine later, and emanating something that smelled like warm earth and green growing things, and something underneath that, something Selim had no word for except necessary. He should leave. He knew he should leave. He was the king. The Omega was in his employ and his protection, in a vulnerable biological state that made any advance or pressure or presence a potentially coercive act. He should leave immediately, send Fenwick with a message about the report, and arrange for a physician to see to Sable in the morning. He did not leave. He took 3 steps into the grove. Sable went still. He didn't turn. Who's there? Your king, Selim said, which was not something he usually said about himself, and something about the situation was making him less precise than usual. Sable turned. His amber eyes were slightly glassy, and there was a flush across his brown skin that hadn't been there this morning, and he looked, immediately, furious. Are you following me? He said. I had a question about the report, which you could have sent via Fenwick. I was already walking. You were already. Sable pressed his fingers to his eyes. I need you to go back inside, Your Majesty. I know. This is not a good time for me too. I know, Selim said again. He hadn't moved any closer. He was rooted where he stood, fighting something large and instinctive and entirely inappropriate. I am going. I wanted to. He stopped, started again. There is a physician on staff, Dr. Hale. She is discreet and competent. I'll send word that you may need her tomorrow. Sable stared at him. There are also rooms in the east wing that are further from the main corridors, Selim continued, his voice very controlled. More private, more contained. Fenwick will arrange the transfer if you prefer. A long silence. Sable's voice had gone quieter. That's considerate, thank you. Don't thank me. The words came out rougher than intended. He turned and walked away quickly, before his instincts could have any further opinions about the matter. He did not sleep at all that night. Chapter 5 Weekly Reports. The heat passed. Sable did not bring it up. Selim did not bring it up. They met weekly in the small council chamber with diagrams and soil samples and maps, and Selim asked his questions and Sable answered them, and sometimes the answers surprised the king, and sometimes the king's questions surprised the Omega, and the palms, slowly, imperceptibly at first, began to recover. The thing that happened between them was not dramatic. That was the thing about it. There was no single moment, no lightning strike. There was only the accumulation of Wednesday mornings, Sable spreading his latest maps on the table, Selim leaning forward to look at them, both of them forgetting the appropriate distance until they were side by side at the table, arms nearly touching, their breath clouding the same cold morning air. There was the afternoon. Selim walked through the grove to check on the crew's progress and found Sable sitting at the base of one of the great central palms, the oldest ones, the ones his great-grandmother had planted, with his knees pulled up and his eyes closed, and an expression on his face that was nothing like the sharp, pragmatic efficiency Selim had come to expect. He looked young. He looked tired in a deep way. He looked like someone who had been carrying something for a very long time. Selim sat down next to him, without quite deciding to. Sable opened one eye. Hello. Hello. Did you need a report? No. Then why? I walked the grove at dusk. It was true, he had been doing it since the second week. You happened to be here. Sable closed his eye again. My mother used to sit at the base of the eastern grove's oldest palm when she was tired. She said something about the root systems, the way they networked together underground made her feel less alone. A pause. I told her that was a strange thing to feel from a tree. What did she say? She said I would understand when I was older, a quiet exhale. I think I'm starting to get it. Selim looked at the great dark trunk beside them, the stain of rot barely visible on this one, this deep in the center of the grove where Sable's treatment had reached first. New growth was already starting at the crown. He could see it if he looked, small unfurling fronds, green as something beginning. She taught you well, he said, your mother. A longer silence. She didn't get to finish, Sable said, simply. The rot moved faster than we expected in Holt's Crossing. She died before I did. He picked up a dead frond from the ground and turned it in his hands. She would have preferred the other way around, but she didn't get a vote. Selim said nothing. There was nothing to say that was better than silence, and he had learned that at least from 3 years of grief. They sat at the base of the oldest palm until the light failed and the evening grew cool, and neither of them moved until the night insects started up their chorus and Sable stood and stretched and said he was going in, and Selim said good night, and they went their separate ways, and nothing was said about any of it. But the next Wednesday, Selim was at the table 10 minutes early. And Sable noticed. Chapter 6 The Paranoia. Here is the thing that Selim had never told anyone. He did not trust the way he felt about things. It was not an abstract philosophical position. It was a learned response, carved into him by the last years of his father's reign, when the old king's illness had made him paranoid and possessive, in ways that his court had dressed up as asterisk strength and decisiveness and the appropriate vigilance of a ruler under threat. Selim had watched his father destroy 4 alliances and a marriage proposal and the better part of the Eastern Merchant Council on the basis of suspicions that lived entirely in the old king's deteriorating mind. He had decided at 18 that he would not be that. The problem was that the decision not to be paranoid and possessive did not automatically cure one of the instincts that led there. It just meant you watched yourself, constantly, with the exhausting vigilance of a guard who was also the prisoner. So when he noticed that he was tracking Sable's movements through the palace, not deliberately, not with any action, but with the automatic awareness of an alpha whose hindbrain had quietly appointed itself the Omega's keeper, he noted it, filed it, watched himself for the escalation. When one of the younger lord's sons visited the palace for a political meeting and spent what Selim felt was an excessive amount of time talking to Sable in the courtyard about the Grove restoration project, Selim felt something that he identified, precisely and without illusion, as jealousy. Raw and stupid and entirely disproportionate. He went back to his office and spent an hour doing administrative work until it passed. When Sable came to the Wednesday meeting with a bruise on his forearm from where a palm frond had come down wrong, Selim's first, immediate animal response was to find whoever had let that happen and do something inadvisable about it. His actual response was to say, carefully, "You should wear long sleeves when working close to the damaged fronds. The edges can be sharp." Sable had looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read and said, "Yes, I know, I forgot." And that had been that. The paranoia was this. He found himself, increasingly, afraid of what Sable was going to do when the palms were saved. He was going to leave, obviously. He had nowhere to be, yes. His village was gone, his home was gone, but an Omega with his skills and his knowledge and his particular quality of infuriating competence would not lack for options. He would go somewhere. He would build something. He would be fine. And Selim would be back in his tower, watching the now healthy palms, and everything would be exactly as it was before, except that it would somehow be worse. He did not say any of this. He filed it with the jealousy and the territorial instincts and the ridiculous urge to ask if Sable was eating enough. And he watched himself. And he kept his voice flat and professional on Wednesday mornings and tried not to sit too close at the table and did not allow himself to take dusk walks on the days when he knew Sable would be in the Grove. It was not working particularly well. Chapter 7, What Sable Noticed. Here is what Sable Wren had noticed in his 5 months at Voss Palace. He had noticed that the king was at his desk before anyone else in the palace and left it after everyone else had gone to bed, and that this was not ambition or dedication, but something closer to avoiding the silence of rooms that had too many hours in them. He had noticed that the king, for all his winterized stillness, had a quality of attention that he gave to very few things, and that the weekly Wednesday meetings were among them, that Selim Voss listened the way people listen to things they were afraid of losing, completely, without reservation. He had noticed that the king never laughed but sometimes, rarely, almost entirely imperceptibly, something happened at the corner of his mouth that was probably the structural precursor to it. He had noticed that Selim had stopped himself, twice, from touching the maps when they were looking at them together. A hand reaching out and then pulling back, a gesture of reaching that he'd redirected into pointing from a distance. As though he'd decided that touching the same thing Sable was touching was somehow too much proximity to permit himself. He had noticed the bruise conversation and what was underneath it. He had noticed the young lord's son in the courtyard, and this was the part he returned to most often, turning it in his hands like the pen he'd turned over on the day he arrived. He had noticed the king watching from the window above. Not lurking, not hostile, just watching, with an expression that Sable had seen on exactly one other face in his life, and that face had belonged to his mother watching the Eastern Grove the last week before she died. It was the face of someone who loved something that was going to leave them. He sat at the base of the great central palm on a cool October evening, the fronds above him rustling with new growth, the brown stain at the trunk's base already fading as the treatment worked its slow way through the root system, and he thought about it for a long time. He was a practical person. He had learned practicality the hard way, the way most people learned it, by having no other choice. He knew his own biology, and he did not sentimentalize it. He had gone through 3 heats in the palace's East Wing with Dr. Hale's quiet professional assistance, and he had come out of each one clear-eyed and functional, and no more confused about himself than he'd been going in. He also knew that the heat at the beginning, the one in the grove, the one the king had walked away from, had hit differently than the ones before it, had hit differently than any heat he could remember. He was a practical person, and he knew what that meant. He had simply been trying to decide what to do about it. He heard footsteps on the grove path. The same footsteps he'd been hearing for 5 months now, at dusk, on the days he'd told himself he was only out here because there was more to check on, more to document, more that needed doing before he could justify going inside. He didn't open his eyes. Hello. A pause. Hello. You don't have to hover on the path, Sable said. You can sit down. A longer pause. Then the sound of Selim sitting at the base of the palm, close enough that Sable could feel the warmth of him in the cool evening air. The new fronds are coming in well, Selim said. Yes. You said 6 months before significant improvement. It's been 5. I may have been conservative. Sable finally opened his eyes and looked at the dark canopy above them, the new growth catching the last of the light. Or the root system is more interconnected than my maps suggested. When you treat one tree, the network carries the treatment to its neighbors. He paused. My mother told me that. The palms look like individuals, but they're a community underground. Helping one helps all. Silence. She sounds, Selim said carefully, like she was remarkable. She was. Sable lowered his eyes from the canopy and looked at the man sitting beside him, really looked, the way he'd been not looking for 5 months. The winter ice eyes were warmer in the evening light. Not warm exactly, but the quality of ice changes depending on what's underneath it, and Sable had spent 5 months noticing what was underneath Selim's. She also would have said I was being remarkably stupid. Selim's gaze shifted to him. About what? About this. Sable turned to face him more fully. About sitting next to you twice a week for 5 months and pretending I'm here because of the palms. The grove went very quiet. You are here because of the palms, Selim said, and his voice was careful in a way that meant he was being very careful on purpose. I was, yes. Sable met the ice-gray eyes without looking away. He'd been doing that since day 1, and he wasn't going to stop now. The palms are doing well. They're going to be fine. You know that as well as I do. A muscle moved in Selim's jaw. And when they are fine, he said, even more carefully, you will. I don't know, Sable said. That's rather what I'm sitting here trying to work out. Another silence, longer this time. I am not, Selim said finally, an easy person. I know. I have been told by people in a position to observe it, that I am paranoid and possessive and cold, and that I have spent 3 years becoming someone who is difficult to love and who has, on some level, arranged it that way deliberately. Sable looked at him steadily. Who told you that? Fenwick, in a letter he left on my desk and then immediately regretted. Fenwick is perceptive. Yes. Selim's eyes dropped to the ground between them. I am telling you these things because you deserve complete information before you work out whatever you're working out. I see. Sable was quiet for a moment. My turn then. Selim looked up. I am also not an easy person, Sable said. I am stubborn to the point of being functionally difficult. I walked 400 miles to argue with a king rather than accept that no one was listening. I talk to trees. I will correct you when you're wrong regardless of the consequences, and I will not apologize for it. And I realize that might be a problem for someone with your particular relationship to authority. He looked at the palm trunk beside them. And I have been alone for a year, and before that I was watching my home die, and I am very tired in a way that I'm not sure rest will fix, and I don't know if I'm working out what I feel or simply what I need." "They might not," said Selim quietly, "be different things." Sable looked at him. The evening light was nearly gone now. They were sitting in the blue dark of the grove, and the new fronds were barely visible above them. And somewhere in the root system below the great old palm, the treatment was still working slowly through the network, helping one help all. "No," Sable said softly, "I suppose they might not." Selim's hand, resting on the ground between them, moved. One small movement, a shift of 2 inches, close enough that the back of his fingers brushed the back of Sable's. Neither of them moved again for a long time. Part 3, New Growth. Chapter 8, The King's Admission. He told Fenwick first. Not because Fenwick needed to know, but because Fenwick would find out anyway and Selim preferred to be the one to say it. "I'm going to make a mistake," he said at breakfast without preamble. Fenwick looked up from his notes. He had worked for Selim for 3 years and had developed a high tolerance for non-sequiturs. "Sire." "The Omega, Ren." Selim looked at his untouched tea. I have feelings about him, which I do not trust." Fenwick set down his notes with the slow care of a man trying not to make any sudden movements. "Your Majesty, why do you not trust them?" "Because I don't trust my judgment about anything I want." Selim's voice was flat, but his hands on the table were flat too, overstill, the way hands got when you were telling them not to move. "I watched my father destroy everything he touched because he could not distinguish between what he needed and what he had the right to claim. I have spent 3 years trying not to be him." "With respect, sire," Fenwick said carefully, "your father never once in my 20 years of service to this house sat with a person and didn't speak rather than speak wrongly." A pause. "And I don't believe he ever told anyone he was afraid of making a mistake." Selim was quiet. "The fear of becoming him," Fenwick continued, with the measured bravery of a small man who had decided the conversation required it, "is not the same as the becoming." The king sat with this for a long moment. "He is Ren is," he stopped, started again. "He does not defer to me, not when it matters. He has corrected me 6 times in our Wednesday meetings, and showed no remorse about any of it." "Yes, I had noticed that." "He told me I was standing too close to a recently treated palm root system last week, because he'd applied a soil amendment that could irritate the skin and hadn't posted the warning sign yet, and he was annoyed at himself for forgetting the sign and took it out slightly on my proximity to the tree." Fenwick blinked. "How did that make you feel?" Selim looked at him with the expression of a man who was not accustomed to being asked that question. "Glad," he said, after a moment, "that there is someone in this palace who will say that to me." "Ah," said Fenwick. "Yes." "Well," Fenwick said, and picked up his notes again. "Then perhaps the appropriate next step is not to tell me about it." Selim stood. He smoothed his jacket. He stood in the morning light of the breakfast room and looked like a king, composed and still and a little terrifying. And then he looked, just briefly, like a 31-year-old man who was scared of something and doing it anyway. "No," he said, "I suppose it isn't." Chapter 9, Difficult Things Said Plainly. He found Sable in the grove the next morning. "I need to say something," Selim said without preamble. Sable didn't look up from the root he was examining. "All right. I am aware that I am the king, and you are in my employ, and there is therefore a structural imbalance in any dynamic between us that means anything I say carries implicit weight beyond my intention, and I want to account for that directly." Sable sat back on his heels and looked up at him. "Okay. I also want to say that you are free to leave. When the work is done, and before it is done at any time of your choosing, there is nothing that obligates you to remain and nothing that would make it difficult for you to go. I want that to be clear." "It's clear." "Good." Selim looked at the morning sky above the grove. With those things established, I would like you to stay, not because the palms need you. You are right, they are going to be fine, but he stopped. Something moved in his face. I have not in 3 years looked forward to anything. Sable was very still. Wednesday mornings, Selim said to the sky. I look forward to Wednesday mornings. I looked forward to yesterday evening. I think about what I want to tell you, things I read, things I notice. I composed 3 observations about the new frond growth last week that I didn't say on Wednesday and then thought about afterward, and he stopped again. I am making this more complicated than it needs to be. You're making it exactly as complicated as you are, Sable said quietly. That's not a bad thing. Selim looked down at him. I stayed past the point the palms needed me, Sable said. I want you to know that. I'm here because this is where I want to be. He stood, brushing soil from his knees. I need you to know that it matters to me what you just said, that I can leave, that you said it first. He met the gray eyes. My designation doesn't mean I need to be kept. I know, Selim said, I know that. Do you? A long pause. I am working on it, he said, and it was perhaps the most honest thing he'd said to another person in 3 years. Sable looked at him for a moment and then did something he hadn't done in their 5 months, hadn't allowed himself to do, had been careful not to do. He reached out and closed his hand around Selim's wrist. Loosely, not capturing, just contact. Okay, he said. Then work on it here. Chapter 10, The Palms in Winter. By December, the rot was retreating visibly. The brown stain on the great central palms had faded to a faint ring at their bases, like a watermark left by a tide that had come in and been turned back. New growth crowned nearly every tree in the royal grove, fresh fronds unfurling, green and improbable in the winter light. The gardening crew had stopped looking at the ground when they worked and started looking up. The king held a small, unannounced ceremony on the winter solstice. Just the household staff, the crew, Fenwick, the physician, and Sable standing at the edge of the grove in the early morning, while the sun came up through the recovered palms and made the new fronds gold. Selim did not make speeches. He had not made a public speech since his coronation, and that one had been short and had apparently terrified everyone present. But he stood at the edge of the grove on the solstice morning and looked at the new growth, and then looked at Sable standing beside him and said, quietly enough that only Sable could hear, My great-grandmother planted the first one herself, with her own hands on the morning of her coronation. She said, my father told me that a kingdom needed something older than itself, something that would outlast it. Sable looked at the oldest palm, the great central one, its trunk now clean of rot, its crown spreading new fronds against the winter sky. She was right. She was a pause. I would like, when the rest are treated and the spread is fully contained, I would like to plant a new one, at the outer edge, a new beginning for the grove. He was quiet for a moment. I would like you to be there when we do. Sable turned to look at him. Here, Selim said, I mean here, I would like you to be here. The winter light came through the palms, in long golden lines. I know what you meant, Sable said. They stood side by side in the grove on the solstice morning, close enough that their arms pressed together in the cold, and Selim, for the first time in the privacy of the grove, without an audience, without occasion, did not pull back. Epilogue Root Systems. Spring came to the royal grove with reckless confidence. Every palm in the inner ring was recovered. The outer ring, the one Sable had feared losing, had surprised them both. The root network had carried the treatment further than predicted, and only 7 of the outermost palms had to be removed in the end, leaving clean earth and a row of newly planted palms in their place, small and determined and still staked against the wind. There was one new planting at the edge of the grove, set slightly apart from the others, larger than the rest, chosen for the vigor of its root system. They had planted it on a gray March morning, just the two of them, with Fenwick watching from a discreet distance and pretending to review paperwork. It was not a dramatic planting. There was no ceremony. Sable dug the hole with the same practical efficiency he brought to everything, and Selim held the tree upright in the earth while the soil was packed around its roots, and Sable said, "You can let go. It'll stand on its own," and Selim released the trunk slowly, and it did. "It'll take 20 years to look like the old ones," Sable said. "I know. Longer before it's part of the network, before its roots reach the others." "I know." Selim looked at the new tree, straight and green in the spring light. "That's fine." Sable looked at him. The king was not a demonstrative person. He was still cold at the edges, still impossible to approach without invitation, still the most unsettling person in any room he walked into. He had woken twice that month from nightmares about his father and had not hidden that he had, and that, Sable thought, was its own kind of courage, the small, unglamorous kind. He was also, on the Wednesday morning 3 weeks ago, found in the small council chamber 20 minutes early with 2 cups of tea, and the look of a man who had decided to stop pretending he wasn't waiting. He was working on it. They were both working on it. Sable picked up the shovel and the stakes and the coil of rope they'd used to guide the planting, and Selim picked up the bag of soil amendment, and they walked back toward the palace together through the grove, through the recovered old palms with their new growth and their clean trunks, through the dappled winter-turned spring light, through the place where the rot had been and wasn't anymore. "The eastern groves," Sable said as they walked. "Beyond the border villages, they haven't been treated." "I know. The same infection could be taking root in the root systems out there, without the treatment." "I've been thinking about it," Selim said. "We would need someone who knows the process, who could work with the local keepers." Sable looked at him sidelong. "We." A pause. "The crown would need someone, an appointed specialist, with authority to direct treatment across the kingdom's groves." Another pause. "It is not a small undertaking." "No," Sable agreed, "it isn't. It would require—" "I'm familiar with what it would require." The old palms moved in the spring wind above them, their new fronds and their old trunks, the ancient and the new in the same canopy. "Well," Sable said after a moment, "good thing I'm not going anywhere." Selim did not smile. He didn't do that, not yet, not quite, but there it was again, that almost motion at the corner of his mouth, the structural precursor to something. His hand at his side found Sable's. Loose, not capturing, just contact. And in the root system beneath the grove, deep underground where no one could see it, the network carried it onward, one to the next, through the living dark of the earth, the way it had always done, the way it would keep doing. One tree helping all the others stand.